Hi, Kristina. It's wonderful to have you here today. And I'm very pleased that Slovene readers will finally get to know your writing in Slovene language. So welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation and hello, everyone.
I would like to start with a bit broader question, and that is how or at what point did you decide to write about Catherine I of Russia? And did you come across a single information that really inspired you or made you interested? Or did you choose her life at first and then started a systematic research?
No, it was 10 years ago. I was writing the second part of my Silva Rerum novel, which was set during the period of the Great Northern War. And I was describing the meeting of Peter the Great and Augustus the Strong in Biržai Castle in Lithuania, which took place at the very beginning of the 18th century. And I came across the fact that apparently Peter the Great's wife was of Lithuanian origin. And I thought, how interesting. Why don't we know anything about it? And then I started digging up. I understood why the people, the readers, the wider audience sort of doesn't know much about her. The Russians were really ashamed of her origins, that she was out of nowhere, that she was a former prisoner of war. To put in other words, she was a sex slave. She was passed from, one officer to another commander and so on. And her whole history was under the wraps, hidden secretly in secret archives in Russia, up to the very end of the 19th century, of the beginning of the 20th century, for that simple reason that the Romanov dynasty, who were keen to make successful dynastic marriages with other ruling houses of Europe, they were quite ashamed of her being, of such a low origins. But sort of the whole history, when I started taking interest in that, I found the most fascinating facts of her life. And she was a really extraordinary personality. She was a product of completely different culture, who happened to be close to Peter the Great, and he was the great westernizer, the great modernizer, but he was still the product of Eastern, of Byzantine culture. So these two people in one marriage, and the witnesses, the historical sources always made point that she was not a pushover. She could stand up to him, and sometimes she used her influence and did it very wisely. I got fascinated with her, and I thought, oh gosh, such an interesting subject. It's, it's the East and the West. It's a man and a woman. It's a toxic marriage where one of the partners has an addiction, because obviously Peter the Great, if we speak in contemporary terms, he was an alcoholic. He was a functioning alcoholic, but you had to take, into the scope his decisions and everything, that he was operating with his addiction all the time. So I matured this idea for 10 years. I looked for many, many reasons not to take this subject, because apparently Peter the Great is such a huge personality, and there are a lot of, Russian TV series, Russian novels, even a Turkish novel about Catherine I. but I thought that I should do it, and I should present it sort of not the romantic version that is functioning in pop culture, but a version strictly based on historical sources.
You mentioned that there were not many things known about Catherine until the 20th century or something, also due to her nationality. But was it also connected to her gender? How is interest in certain historical figures connected to their gender beyond the romantic idea of a wife or a mother or a savior?
So it is an interesting thing that Peter the Great, he was in some sense, he was a proto-feminist. He was very encouraging towards the women taking the place in society, because the Russian culture used to keep even the most noble women in a terem, which was a special space in the old ancient Slavonic palace, and it was almost equivalent of the harem, because they didn't have much opportunity to voice their opinions. The best they could appear during some festivities or balls, with a pitcher of wine to serve the distinguished guests, but they were, seen but not heard. And he was inspired, Peter the Great was inspired by the Western culture and how women could participate in conversation, take decisions, be, active members of the high society, and he encouraged also this mode into the Russian culture. He was always attached to Western women. Anna Mons, his first mistress, was the daughter of the German wine merchant, and then came Martha, who was completely out of nowhere, but he got fallen in love with her, and she became a super important person in his life. And therefore, he crowned her the first empress of Russia. This is really significant because there were many rulers, many tsarinas before her. There are quite a few powerful women. Peter's half-sister Sophia, who was a regent, comes to mind. But there were not a single empress in her own right before. And Catherine I, paradoxically, being of such a lone origins, she opened the way for a number of Russian empresses, because Russia was ruled by women in the 18th century. There were Anna Ioannovna, there were Anna Leopoldovna, Yelizaveta, the Catherine's daughter, and then of course Catherine the Great. But there wouldn't have been Catherine II without Catherine I. That's the paradox.
What would you say, why is Catherine not only important for the history of Russia, but for the broader history of Europe or the world in general?
I think that the author, the writer, doesn't select the subject or the personality just for the reason of he or she being important for history. There are many fascinating, important historical characters. I chose her simply for her life story because it's so human. It's so, she has, her life has such a scope of misery, of triumph, of love, of betrayal. Really, I mean, the things she had to experience in her life, that would be enough, for 10 or 100 lives. And her instinct of survival, her adaptability, at the same time, her super strong spine, she fascinated me purely and simply as an extraordinary human being.
But one thing is to find a story, and the other thing, I think, is to find a voice. how did you find the voice of the Catherine? Does it come from the sources that you gained, or is it something that you felt intimately that it has to sound like this, or was there another story behind it?
It's a very good question, because when writing a historical novel, author is always challenged to find the perspective and to find the voice. And my tetralogy of historical novels, Silva Rerum, in 4 parts. It's about a noble family and its 4 generations, set in Poland and Lithuania. It's written without a dialogue. So you don't hear the character's voice. It's more like a saga that is being told by someone sitting at the fireplace. So I wanted to have this sound, because my character spoke many languages at that time, from Latin, French, Polish, Lithuanian, and so on. Whereas I was very curious to give her a voice, to give Catherine the first voice, because she was silenced by history for 2 reasons. History was written by men, and the main history, the history as a scientific subject, until recently has always concentrated onto the rulers, leaders, mostly men. And I wanted to describe the history and the experience and the war and the brutality of the war through the female perspective. That's one. Catherine was also silent for another reason. She was illiterate. There are surviving letters written when she dictated. And you can hear her voice, her phrases, some private, sometimes obscene jokes that she shares with Peter the Great. So that was very helpful. But also her voice is heard in other historical sources. For example, when someone who was present at the court, he describes a certain situation and he voices her over. The ambassador, for example, quotes, and then the empress said this and that. And then from those tiny pieces, I tried to puzzle together like a jigsaw, to create her own voice and her own perspective. And that was a very fascinating task. So it's written in the first person. It's like she lies dying and she speaks.
Also, you've already mentioned sources as being an important part of your process. How do you approach sources? How do you decide what to use or what not to use? And also, how do sources meet imagination, or how do sources meet art?
Well, it's very often the journalists and the readers, they ask the question, okay, so in your novels, what percentage there's fact and what percentage is fiction? I'm not an accountant. I don't calculate the percentage. It's irrational. When you create, it's rational. On the other hand, how do I approach historical sources? I approach historical sources professionally because of my academic background. I hold a doctorate in the history of art. So I'm used to working with sources, letters, and archives. In this case, what was different, for example, when researching Silva Rerum novels and when researching the sources about Peter the Great, so the multitude of sources on Peter the Great, sometimes that very same situation had several slightly different versions and sources depending on who was describing it. If it's ambassador to the Austrian emperor, there might be another version. If it's a Russian courtier, it might be slightly different version. If it's a Polish envoy, then something might differ. And then I had this Rashomonic view of citation, which was very helpful, because you don't have a flat two-dimensional image of history. You have it, from different perspectives. And then I tried to find out the most truthful and plausible version of the events. So it was very, very fascinating. And the sources are, the amount of sources is huge. I mean, there's the court diary of Peter the Great, there's a personal diary of Menshikov, his best friend and former lover of Catherine the First as well. So it was written by his courtier. So I knew what dreams they had. I knew what was the weather in St. Petersburg on the day she died. And that was very helpful, just to recreate the whole atmosphere. The other thing, that when you have such a huge amount of historical information, it's the question of leaving things out. Because very often when a writer for the first time takes up the genre of historical novel, he or she sometimes is overwhelmed by every tiny detail that they find in the archives, and then they get too fascinated and they try to sort of include everything in the literary work, in the novel, and you cannot do that. So coming from that world of science and knowing that the sources are vast, I was always very clear about being able to self-edit. And yes, sometimes there are fascinating historical characters you have to leave out because they do nothing for the narrative. For example, Shafirov, one of Peter the First ministers, was a very interesting person. He was a Jew from Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and his life story is very important, interesting. But how was he important to the love triangle of Peter the Great, Menshikov, and Catherine? Practically, I had to leave him out.
You've mentioned, we were talking about the historical sources, and you mentioned several times that you come from academic background. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask, how differently do you feel when you write or think in terms of academia or in terms of art novel? What is more stressful or what is more pleasurable, if you could put it that way?
I like both fields, to be honest, and some of my former professors who know me from my student years, they commented that even when I was doing my baccalaureate, I wrote very engagingly, and they read my work like a good crime story. And here in fiction, on the contrary, I try to research as much as possible. The answer, how is that different? Academic writing from a historical fiction writing. You've mentioned one word in your question, which is super important. You asked me, how do I feel? So the feeling and the emotion is what differs academic text, which has to be objective, impassionate, very matter of fact, super convincing by arguments. Whereas when I write some scene in my historical novel, yes, the scientist in me is still there. I'm interested how, what, when, for what reason, and so on. But I'm also, and that's the crucial point, I'm interested in what my characters might have felt, what they feel when this is happening. And I think this empathy is crucial for any writer, to be able sort of to leave yourself out of this and to be able to empathically impersonate this or that character. It's a bit like method acting. It's a bit like Stanislavski method in theater. You have to sort of get under the skin of that character.
I would also like to believe in empathy in academia, but I understand where you're coming from. Whenever we research or write, we come across certain things that change us or maybe influence us in different way. And I was wondering, what was for you personally the most important lesson that you gained from researching Catherine's life?
Okay, research of Catherine's life. For me, it was very emotionally exhausting, because if you are empathical towards your characters, and your main character is being raped, she's constantly bereaved because of the death of her children. Well, it was difficult to write some scenes. I won't hide that. On another level, this book, I think it's also musing, a contemplation of two very important subjects: of power, what power does to a person, how it changes that person, and time. Because one of the main subjects of this book is always the time. It is set in 24 hours. First part is 12 hours, and another part, the second part, is another 12 last hours of the emperor's lives. And readers notice how it's written in the real life. If you read it in Lithuanian, so one chapter is indeed 1 hour. So I had to be very strict towards the amount of pages in each chapter. And it's also about experiencing the time, how time is being counted, but it can also be experienced differently emotionally. Time is very important in Peter I's story, because he was the person who changed the Russian calendar. The Russian New Year used to be in autumn, and he made the whole country to start celebrating the New Year on the 1st of January, like the rest of the world, though Russia had different calendar up to the revolution in 1917. And in some sense, Peter the Great, in my opinion, he was racing with the time. And hence the time is very important, because he wanted to implement structures and social mechanisms and customs that in Europe they took centuries to crystallize, to come into living, and he wanted to do that very fast. He was very impatient. He had those great, fantastic ideas, but he wanted them to be ahead of time and to close the gap between the Russia and the rest of Europe very quickly, which was probably impossible.
You mentioned the time as something very important, but also in writing historical novel, the time is always something magical, where the past comes together with the present, and you have to combine, as an author, you have to combine both. You have to think of the readers who will read this in 21st century, and at the same time stay true to the past as it was, or as you imagine it to be. how is it for you combining those two worlds? But is it a big challenge for you, or does it come natural?
No, again, I'm very relaxed about it because of my historical background. So it's the task of the historical novel since its origins, because I think the Iliad and Odyssey by Homer is a sort of historical novel. And he wanted to retain that memory of the great deeds for the future generations, but at the same time he was speaking, quite a lot of time after they took place. So it's always, the author is always present in historical novel, the author and his time. You cannot escape that. But what helps and what is very important, I think that you should do your homework before writing historical novel and try to get all the facts and details as accurate as possible. And then it will be convincing, this meeting of the past and the present on the page, because otherwise, I don't know how it is for you, but if I take a historical novel and I start reading it and I find some obvious blunders or anachronisms that couldn't take place, it's sort of, it's ruined like a house of cards. It's instantly crumbles because I can't believe the author, and I would like to believe when reading a historical novel.
Are your plans for the future writing also based in, are you planning to write a new historical novel, or are you planning to stay in this genre, or are you thinking about trying different voices as an author?
I don't know. I think nothing could be excluded. I also wrote a short story collection, which is completely contemporary. It's 8 stories told in completely different social dialects, and they're all set in present. So I think nothing can be excluded in the future. It's just one thing, I'm very superstitious and I never ever comment on anything while I write and while I work.
For the end, I would just like to ask one more, let's say, a fun question. You mentioned pop culture at the beginning, and talking about Catherines and Russia, we can't escape the question of if you watched the Hulu series The Great, with the title The Great, which is about Catherine the Great, and the second season just came out, or you didn't, or what are your feelings on that?
Oh gosh, I watch a lot of TV series as a research, because I'm interested in what's happening in popular culture and how these subjects are approached. And there's also TV series with Helen Mirren, which were filmed in Lithuania, and moreover in the beautiful Pažaislis convent where I escaped to write. So this place is very dear to my heart. And you mentioned The Great, the Zulu production. I think it's truly awful. I think it's something that is made by idiots for imbeciles. I won't refrain, but that's my opinion, because it has nothing to do neither with the historical truth, neither with atmosphere, and it's as bad as it could get. If I should mention one equranization, one film after a historical novel, which is actually better than the historical novel itself, and that's a rare case, I would mention a French film by Patrice Chéreau, The Queen Margot. because to take such a I don't know, romantic, somewhat sentimental novel by Dumas, and to recreate it in the true spirit of the time, with all the cruelty, with all the depravity, and so on, and to do this so beautifully, it's really extraordinary. So.
Thank you for this. So I would like to thank you once again for being with us, and invite all the Slovene readers to take your book. It was just printed, so it's a fresh read for the new years or all the years that are coming. So I hope we'll be able to read your future work or your past work in Slovene language as well. And once again, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.